The goddess workshop, it's the mother's voice that comes through loud and
It's
clear.
right. There's this little kind of inner pragmatist in Sandy that she has to hear as Janet's voice. So every time someone says something at the goddess workshop, a little voice that she thinks is Janet's just saying, "This is ridiculous, what a waste of money." And of course, Janet's not even really there. It's actually Sandy wishing she had that kind of, inner voice, I think, that's a bit more kind of, or less extreme.
And Rick's parents.
Oh, yes, well...
They made me very pained.
Yeah, well, see, that's the thing. See, Rich has got this little kind of, as Rich is walking, he's bought new boots, and that's fatal, isn't it, when you start a bushwalk? And he's...
He has a bleeding blister.
He gets a blister that he chooses to ignore or pretend is not there, and he's going to keep on walking on it because it's getting worse and worse and worse, till finally he has to confront the fact that it's actually stopping him from walking, which becomes a kind of a metaphorical thing that he has to deal with, and it's going to keep coming up from beneath this thing that you better think about it. And as the book progresses, I'm not going to give you too much of a spoiler, but as it progresses, you realise he does have his secrets, and he is very bitter to think of himself like his father, who he sees as a man who is totally emotionally locked up. And he and his father have almost colluded, I guess, in a way, to put his mother into a nursing home. And it's not really, you're not really sure, I don't think he's really sure whether in fact that was justified or not, because there's this big sort of family alcohol, secret and so on. So he has this background that once you begin to kind of see him and as the damaged man he is, I'm really sort of hoping that there is that sense that these people have dimension and they're real, and we feel...
And they're doing the best they can.
That's the thing, isn't it? And I guess that's what I always think about characters, and if you've read any of the short stories, you'll understand that is a big preoccupation of mine. It's just people who are ordinary are just so extraordinary. People who are just normal, who are just trying to do the best they can. I find my empathy is with them. I don't find I write about characters who are doing anything particularly extraordinary. I like to find that drilling down moment when the person who's going for the job interview is sitting on the bus or something, or it's the first Christmas after Dad's left or something, where we actually have a day that could not be more mundane, I guess. I find I go towards the mundane. And
the inarticulate.
Yes.
You often have characters that are unable to speak, but there's something in the way you allow their backs at the sink to be expressing what it is going on in their heads. It's remarkable.
I know, just the scene you're talking about, where in that Angel, particular story, I think actually it's in Tender. Tender. There's a story. Well, there we go. What could be more ordinary? A woman is about to go the next day to have a biopsy on a lump in her breast, and they live in the country, so it's a big thing to just take the car to the station and get the train to the city, and she has to organise her husband to look after the kids that day, and they're both wondering if the kids know what she's going to the city for. Like, it could not be a more mundane thing, but there's a bit in it where he won't turn around, but he's talking to her, and I think it says in the story, and she watches his back as he washes those glasses till they're way past clean. And it is those moments that you notice, don't you, in every day, with people who are not articulate, but it's the things that they do which are so revealing and just cut me, I guess, to the quick, when I notice people betraying all the things they're trying to keep secret because they no longer can keep them secret.
And you live in the country.
I do.
And you've been moving around the world, of course, but you live in the country and your family's in the country and you're married to a farmer.
Correct.
Now, I've watched you telling stories. There was a wonderful storytelling night in Melbourne recently where Cate held the floor and told stories which reminded me of those stories that are told around the kitchen table in country houses, which I know about as well, where secrets are not revealed but they're touched on, where there's a real sense of the retelling, and each time it's told, something else is starting to shift.
Yeah.
It's the moments of truth that families need in a ritual sort of way. I think you've got a lot of that, and I wonder whether that has enabled... See, in your short stories, you've got a single point of view, as I said before. In the novel, you have many points of view, but you haven't lost your storytelling skills. It's like... this is a huge novel made of many stories, many stories. So does it come from a country psyche? Is that a useful question? Do you know what I'm trying to say?
I do know what you're trying to say, and I guess...
You don't get it in the city so much.
Well, maybe not, but I think maybe it's more... That may be because the remnants of what I'm interested in survive better in non-metropolitan areas, by which I mean that kind of sense that you don't have to report on yourself all the time and sort of say what you're feeling all the time, because
and
it's what people do that really is revealing, and the way they live their life that is revealing. And sometimes I do see that, where I'll hear something from someone, or I'll see that they're doing something, and the sort of what's going on for them is suddenly broken open in a way which feels like it's been made manifest. So maybe it is more of a country, or maybe it's an old generational thing, because certainly my grandparents' generation were much, much better at this than we are. That you just let things go, and people were more tolerant of each other, and we understood that there was a lot going on for people under the surface. And I must say that was actually very hard. That was a hard thing to do, because using different points of view and writing from a point of view I didn't actually happen to agree with. I didn't really feel Rich's kind of fury at Sandy, but I had to kind of stay with him and write in his voice. And equally, you know, Sandy and Sophie's points of view, they weren't mine. And it's funny how I really wanted to make them really not particularly likeable. Not particularly likeable until you actually began to realise what was going on for them.
So where is your point of view? Is it in the world beneath?
I think it's in that there is one more point of view in the book, and that's the people say you put yourself in the book as the hero. The point of view of the rescue operator.
Oh yes, a lovely rescue operator.
He's got a little story of his own, actually, and he doesn't have much to say in the book. But I wanted there's a really important scene at the end of the book, and I wanted someone who didn't know what was going on under the surface between these people to tell us what was happening, not what people were thinking and what they were feeling, but what it looked like from someone who was a stranger. So he described what people were doing, but he didn't know what it meant, and the reader knew what it meant. And I really wanted to step back from the story then to give that perspective. So I made up another character.
That's fascinating.
Who's the person who just happens to be there in the helicopter, the search and rescue operator, because they were great guys. I met some of them in Tasmania when I was doing research for the book, and they did strike me as exactly the people you're talking about. They were kind of very reticent and quite laconic. And they wouldn't have been promoting themselves as heroic, but they do terribly dangerous things, and they just keep doing it day after day in a very quiet sort of way. And so I made up a fourth character who doesn't know those dynamics between the trio, but I thought, yes, I'm going to put him in there so that we can see what it's like for him.
Yeah. But you had to manipulate all of those other ingredients.
That's
Structurally,
what was hard.
It must have been difficult. Can you talk about the structural in a way we can share? Because it's when you're very good at short stories, at perfectly crafted short stories often, it's, I would think, much more difficult to juggle.
The only way I could think of, yes, it was. That was hard to do.
Did you have plot it? Did you plan it? Did you know who you were? Did you line them up, 3 points of view?
I wanted to find that if you took one person's story out of the story, it would still have its own shape.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in structure. But I was lucky to happen upon the idea of, well, two things really. One was the kind of the Greek idea of the story, which is the only story really for me. Someone who's reluctant is pushed into a set of circumstances that they wouldn't have chosen for themselves, and then we see what they are made of. And when they try and return from that experience, they are changed. I mean, that is the story of the human condition, really, isn't it? Every story is that story in some way. Someone wants something and they can't get it, and they have to go and try and get it. So I wanted each character to have that. And so I was lucky to have, the classics, because that, of course, is...
It's perfect.
And then, of course, I thought, well, where can they go to find this underworld? And Tasmania just seemed so perfect, because someone showed me a map while I was thinking about this book, and, of course, this part of Tasmania, the Lake St Clair National Park, some wise person has named all those landmarks after Greek mythology. Yes. So there's like Acropolis Mountain, and there's Narcissus Creek. I mean, how perfect for someone like Rich to have to splash through Narcissus Creek in his new boots, feeling pissed off with his daughter because she's too slow or something,
Or too fast.
Too fast for him, actually, yes, because he's coming along. So all those things, and I was lucky. And then I thought, well, that's going to be perfect, because having a walk to do gives me a sort of a chronology to think about. And there's even a little Latin quote in the book. I think it's solvitur ambulande, which means it is solved by walking. So I had to walk, and then I could kind of pin it together that way. But yes, I was very concerned that those big messy stitches of my inexperience were going to be really, really evident, because of course you can polish and polish a short story, and it's one small little beautiful fragment, you know. But a novel is a much bigger, messier animal, and you sort of go into the study of a morning with, like, you know, a chair and a whip, you know, trying to sort of keep it under control. That's why the novel is in such little fragments, and I had to think about it almost like a film. What can I cut away to so that you want it to keep going, but I've cut here and taken you to... So that was made it
every
easier.
chapter is interweaving the different points of view. That's the other very cool thing.
The thing that seemed hard at first became a kind of a, as I wrote, seemed more of an asset, because then I could make things happen that you can't make happen in a short story. Because you can heap complication upon complication, and someone will say something, you know, Sophie will say something that will provoke Rich to do something more risky. So they'll do something more risky, and then he'll say something that'll provoke her to have an outburst at him, and then suddenly we are getting down to the root of it. In fact, I might read that section where she does actually confront him on the walk, where she actually begins to think, when they do get lost, needless to say.
They head off the track.
They head off the track.
Away from the tourists.
How perfect.
There are millions of tourists.
There is a place, this place, it's called the Labyrinth. How more ideal could that be? I was just sitting there waiting for me to use it. They do go to the Labyrinth, and like many, many other walkers, they get lost because everything looks the same in the Labyrinth. And so I'm just going to read the little bit where they're lost, and Sophie begins to think that perhaps Rich has engineered this.
Oh, yes.
And he hasn't, I don't think. He's just been incompetent.
They're exhausted. She's losing it too, isn't she?
She's losing it too, that's right, which of course does peel back a few more layers, doesn't it? And she's really furious. So this is the bit where, once again, apologising for language. No matter what he tried to pull over her eyes, Sophie thought darkly, she wasn't an idiot. She couldn't stop thinking now about how clear-cut the planned route had been at first. The stand walk, nothing risky, everything in place. And yes, she'd agreed with him more or less about coming here to camp for a night instead of that hut, hadn't she? He could make you feel great when you wanted to. Maybe he just talked her into it, charming her till she said yes. Sure, it might have been different if the storm hadn't happened. There was no way he could have planned for that, but still, this, of everything in the world, was the thing that would totally make her mother freak. If that was what he wanted, to really do her head in, he'd chosen the perfect thing. The more she thought about it, as they shook out the tent the next morning and tried to wring it out before rolling it up, the more possible it seemed. Now when she'd looked at his face more closely, she couldn't believe she hadn't noticed it before. The set of the mouth, the bad actor lines of concern between his eyes, and that calculating wink he'd given her as they passed that sign put there to warn them. She felt a cold creep of devious possibility, of trickery. He'd used her. She'd been sucked in. She stood up slowly from the tent roll, more and more details occurring to her now, watching him as he stood there pretending to study that brochure again with the map that didn't tell him anything. All going according to plan, she said softly. His eyes slid to her first, creepily, then he turned his whole head and she saw a flash of fear there. What? You did this on purpose, didn't you? She thought she could tell a liar. She watched his face cloud with affront, his mouth going slack. What are you talking about? Dragging us out here, showing off. You wanted us to get lost, didn't you? Come on now, just think for a second. I mean, I know you're upset, but think. She could see it in his face clearly now, the whole bag of tricks he had in his repertoire ready to bring out. The reasonable calm, the funny charisma, the pleasant smile. She'd watched him turn it on at the museum that day, and then on this walk too. Whenever he wanted something from someone, that's what he could do, so he did it. Like now, the way he tried to touch her arm and get to her that way. You fuck off, you total loser. She spat, shoving him away. Whoa, whoa, whoa. She jumped up and walked away, pacing. Nowhere to go, no daughter's lamb. Give me a single reason why I'd actually try to get us lost. So you could impress me, so you could pretend to be a big hero, to get back at Mum. As soon as the words were out, she could feel she'd hit a nerve. He stepped backwards as if she'd shoved him in the chest, his arms raised in defence. You're stressed out and not thinking clearly. That's just crazy. You don't know, Sophie muttered, her teeth gritted. You have no idea how much the idea of me even coming away with you went against all her instincts. She sat down on her pack and straightened out her legs, trembling. You see, she knew. Better than I did, obviously. Knew what kind of a dick you were. Look, I know Sandy's got her own take on me, but if you think I'm trying to prove something to you by bringing you here, not being 100% sure where we are, well, you're insane. I told you, there's nothing to worry about anyway. This is what camping's all about, or used to be all about anyway, before they turned it into a bloody package tour they're trying to sell us out there now. You went into the wilderness and just found your way, you pitched your tent in spots you chose, stayed warm by lighting a fire, obeying the rules of nature, keeping in touch with the elements. Well, we camped on the Franklin. She dug her hands into her hair and pulled, groaning in frustration. Will you just stop talking about the fucking Franklin? There was a silence, and then he flared at her. You have no idea, you know that? We put ourselves in the line out there, nothing but mud and rain and freezing cold, but we were determined to see it out. We stopped the dozers. No, you didn't. He faltered, mouth open as he stared. What? You think I haven't been listening to this stuff for my whole life? Mum's got all the books, bunch of photos and news clippings, everything. She's been shoveling it down my throat since the day I was born. I've done bloody school projects on this. You didn't stop one bulldozer going in there and ripping up the forest. I can't believe we're having this conversation. We stopped the dam. We saved a pristine wilderness. She closed her eyes. The election's what stopped the dam. You guys were really just a nuisance. They held up the HEC for a while, weren't you? You make yourself sound like a big hero, but really what did you do? Sorry, I thought I just told you. You just showed up when it comes down to it. Someone had to organise everything and have the idea for it. Someone had to plan it all out, but it wasn't you. You showed up. Someone drove you out there. Someone told you where to camp. Someone fed you. And then someone else boated you up the river and then someone else arrested you. Drove it all the way, really. What's so heroic about that? Why don't you just get over yourself? I went to jail pressing to save that river. Yeah, for what, 2 days? Listen to you, trying to make it sound like Guantanamo Bay. He wanted to start giving her a lecture. She could tell by the way he pointed a finger at her. But his eyes followed hers to the outstretched finger, to the way it waved there, pointlessly, shaking. Oh. My God, he was crying.
Oh. That's wonderful, Kate, absolutely. I think we'll throw it open to questions now at that point. There's lots to talk about environmentalism and commodification of the wilderness and all that stuff.
The bigger themes, as well as the human relationships, that's right.
We could go on and on and on. But are there questions? Yeah.
Do you write down all the concepts that you want and then order them? How do you go about that?
You know, it's funny. I feel like I've learned everything I have learned about structure from the short story because that's such a difficult craft to master, to do it well. And in a short story, there's a teacher told me a great thing once, because everyone gets so caught up with plot all the time. Like, can we make plot the thing that drives the story? Whereas in fact, character is really the thing that, once we have a character who's earned our interest, some small thing to me seems to be able to happen and we're still interested in that person. And this lecturer said to me, don't worry about plot, I can describe plot to you in 3 words, things get worse. And I've never forgotten that fantastic advice. Yeah. And I guess what I wanted to do for each person was, each of those characters, was just sit with that one character and think, how can I make things get worse for them? So that what they, it sounds so mean, doesn't it, and cold-blooded, make it so the very thing they don't want is going to happen, to make them keep relinquishing. It's like they're all holding a hand of cards. And how can I make them spend this hoarded thing, this hand of cards they don't want to play? And so I made something happen that was the last thing any of them wanted. I made the worst thing happen. Like, for example, with Sandy, she keeps thinking to herself, I can't wait until my life can get started, when I can stop just being a mother, when Sophie might go to the city to uni, and I can actually get my life started by myself and think about myself for a change. And of course, when her daughter gets lost, she is absolutely by herself, and that is not what she wants. In fact, it's that isolation and terrible loneliness that actually forces her to move on, I guess. So I found each of them had their own little kind of arc. And the best thing to realise was the other person could be the thing that gets worse. It doesn't have to be a storm or a meteor about to hit Earth or, you know, these sort of outside forces. It can actually be another person. It can be the last thing you want to happen to you. So to be with someone who is provoking that stuff out of you. So I found a way to kind of mesh them together. So Sophie wouldn't have those suspicions if Sandy wasn't the sort of mother that she was. She wouldn't have all that sort of one-sided history. Rich wouldn't feel so infuriated and perhaps make such rash decisions to show off to her if they all hadn't kind of already had this sort of, estranged history that's going to force them into this new momentum, I guess. So, yeah, it was an interesting process.
Now, one more question before we finish.
Okay, good question. Avid reader, I guess. Always loved reading. Made the mistake, I think, in lots of ways of going to uni to study writing when I finished school and didn't write anything else for a decade when I left.
Wow.
Did lots of other stuff, but just found that the analysis of writing and the deconstruction of it and the picking apart of what you've done just was not very conducive to actually inventing anything or creating anything new. And I think I kind of continued and had a great decade of doing other things, decade and a half almost, and then working in a library kind of got me started again because that started that fantastic slow buzz of just lighting that fuse about how just wonderful it is to think about language and work in language. And then it was still a bit of a hobby at that point, this was in the mid-90s, and then making that, I don't know whether people have heard in other sessions talking about this, I actually went to work for 2.5 years in Mexico with Australian Volunteers International, working with a microcredit cooperative of peasant farmers, and coming home from that experience, there was sort of reverse culture shock of trying to return after being somewhere so different and so outside my comfort zone was the thing that kind of pushed me off a precipice where I thought, I have to write now or go insane. So it became this urgency to just comfort myself with the idea of making account of things. All these things that are happening to us. Life comes in, doesn't it? Life pours onto us, and it just seems so arbitrary and random and unfair and chaotic. And sort of, to make it into stories makes it kind of coherent. And that's become as much of an addiction now, I guess, as the reading is an addiction. So it's been a long, slow process, and I'm glad it's been a long, slow process. I'm glad I threw everything I wrote when I finished uni, really, because I'm glad I didn't get started in my early 20s, because now I feel like I have this richness and a wealth of other people's beautiful stories and observations and friendships and so on, which I can draw on. It's like having a well to dip into now. So that's been its own reward, I guess. It's always going to be its own reward now. Yeah.
And presumably this has enabled you to very gently weave in environmentalism and the critique of commodification and all of the political dimensions to the novel that we haven't really touched on.
Yes.
But the novel is political as well as psychological.
Yes. And I hope people don't think that the opinions of the narrators are my opinions. I needed to invent people who would provide push and pull for each other to provoke these things. But yes, there is at the bottom, the world beneath this novel is my own concerned world about the way we are in nature and the way we are in the natural world and the way that nature just is. It's just this implacable force that we're going to look into like a mirror, and whatever it shows us about ourselves, we better learn to pay attention to. Yeah.
Well, on that note, Kate, it was terrific.
Okay,
Lovely.
thank you. Thanks, Hilary.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thanks very much. Thank you for coming.